Catholicism is often touted today as one of the most lasting legacies of Spain in the Philippines. We see evidence of this in the number of Catholics in the Philippines and the structures that were left behind as well, such as the churches and the images of saints, as you can see here. It is also often said that this took place in a quick and easy manner. But as we will see, it was often complicated and uneven. Moreover, the agency of the Filipinos and the role of the Filipinos in this acceptance or rejection of Catholicism is often overlooked. So today we will discuss this with this as our perspective, and we will look at the evangelization and conversion in the early Spanish Philippines. Official histories tell us that Catholicism and conversion began when Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521. Proof of this is the fact that Magellan and the Augustinians with him were able to baptize about 800 Cebuanos, including Raja Humabon and his wife, Queen Juana. In fact, Queen Juana was given a Santo Niño by Magellan, which she accepted with grace and apparent delight. This is often taken to symbolize the fact that Filipinos accepted Christianity from that point on. A full generation later, the Legazpi expedition arrives in Cebu and does not find the warm welcome that had been given to Magellan and his men. In fact, what they find is that they are treated with hostility and outright denial of resources. A battle ensues, and in the process, the Spaniards burn down one of the larger houses. To their surprise, when they entered into the house, they found the self-same Santo Niño that had been given by Magellan to Queen Juana. And the little Santo Niño was in a place of apparent respect. It was in an altar-like area which was covered with flowers and some offerings, and it was in the company of other statues similar to anitos or bululs. Now always people find what they want to find, and because of that the Spaniards interpreted this as a sign that they were on the right mission of colonization and conquest and evangelization in the Philippines. From the pre-Hispanic Philippine perspective, however, I think it means that the Santo Niño was welcomed into the pantheon of deities that we had at the time and became one of the anitos for whoever owned this house. The official story is that conversion and evangelization in the Philippines occurred very quickly and easily. However, there are certain realities we know of that make this a questionable premise. What are some of these? First, the distance between Spain and the Philippines, especially given the technology at the time. The geography, topography, and climate of the Philippines was vastly different from that of Spain and would necessitate a great deal of adjustment. We also know that the Philippines had about 120 plus Austronesian languages everywhere, forming, of course, an obstacle to anyone who would want to convert a mass of people. Related to the others would also be a shortage of priests and missionaries from Spain. And finally, often discounted, but to me, a very important aspect would be the resiliency of indigenous beliefs and practices in the Philippines. First, the distance from Spain to the Philippines. As you can see from this map of the Magellan expedition, they first made a transatlantic crossing from Spain to South America, rounding the Strait of Magellan. From there, they made a long trans-Pacific crossing and ended up in the Philippines. As time went on, the voyage evolved to be one that went from Spain making a transatlantic crossing to land in Mexico. From Mexico, there was a 6 to 8 week overland voyage to get to the Pacific coast in Acapulco. And then from Acapulco, that's when they would take the long trans-Pacific voyage to the Philippines. All in all, the voyage would take about 9 to 12 months total, and of course, would result in a lot of difficulties and obstacles for those who were on the ships, particularly those who were not sailors, such as the missionaries. Secondly, the geography and topography of the Philippines was very difficult and new for many of the Spaniards, especially the Spanish missionaries. They were not used to the tropical heat and the monsoon rains, the thick forests that resulted from the monsoon rains and the heat, and because of this, it was often difficult for them to get from one place to the other. The climate was also something very new to them, and because of this, many of the Spanish missionaries were ill-equipped to deal with the climate. For one thing, to deal with the monsoon rains, the torrential rains, and the tropical heat, they only had woolen cassocks with them, which caused a great deal of discomfort and illness as well. The numerous languages of the Philippines would also become an obstacle to the missionary activity. Of course, it is evident that in order to convert people, you would have to communicate with them. And as we know, there were about 120 plus Austronesian languages in the Philippines at the time. The Spaniards, of course, are not neophytes in this. They had already learned from their experience in South America that it was probably much easier and faster for the Spanish missionaries to learn the languages rather than for the Spanish missionaries to teach Spanish to all the inhabitants of the land and only then to try and convert them. In response to this, what the Spanish officials did was to assign the religious orders into linguistic areas rather than to areas of preference. The result was Augustinians were given Bulacan, Batangas, Pampanga, Ilocos, Cebu, Panay, and so on down the line. And because of this, you will see that each order had to learn at most 3 Filipino languages. And this made it more efficient for them to pass on their knowledge and also to convert people. One of the results of this, of course, would be the vast array of diccionarios and vocabularios which we have, which occur in almost every single language of the Philippines. And they record not only the words that they needed for conversion, but maybe inadvertently also the lifestyle and the worldview of many of our ancestors. A fourth issue would be the shortage of priests. And this may seem difficult to imagine, but as you know, it was not an easy voyage. It was also difficult for them to adjust to the climate, the geography, perhaps the local illnesses that took their toll as well as you can see from this photograph from the movie The Mission, the reluctance of the natives or the inhabitants to accept what they had to offer. I think it also had to do with the personality of the priest. Why do I say this? Because I have come across many different documents which show that the inhabitants of the Philippines reacted often to the personality of the priest. So we have stories of priests who went in and out of villages, very at home, welcomed by everyone. And at the same time, often in the same area, we would have a priest who would be murdered or driven away before he could achieve anything. And fifth, and to me more important than all of them, would be the resilience of indigenous beliefs and culture in the Philippines. This is often overlooked and it is often laid to the side, but as we know, Filipinos had agency of their own, and in fact, many of the practices we recognize as Catholic today are actually pre-Hispanic in origin or have pre-colonial roots. The result was a very distinct religion that can be called Filipino Catholicism. So, based on the reading that we had, we can ask this question, can religions be combined? And MacDonald says there are many ways that this can be done. So, there is coexistence, when two different religious systems coexist. Can you think of an example of this? There is also complementary, when they can complement and tolerate each other, like Buddhism and Shinto. There is syncretism. Elements of religious system A merge into religious system B. And there is the cult, which combines elements from two or more religious systems into a new cult. Examples of this would be millenarian movements in the Philippines. So what is the result here in the Philippines? Is it a cult? Is it complementary? Is it coexisting? One thing we must take note of is that the Catholicism that arrived in the Philippines came from Spain, and it was based on a Mediterranean folk style of Catholicism. And because of this, if you look closely at it, it was officially monotheistic with a belief in God, but there were a great deal of polytheistic belief systems, like belief in the cults of the saints, the angels, and the lower demons and stuff. Philippine indigenous systems were very similar. There was the idea of a supreme being, maybe in the form of Bathala, but there was also a pantheon of divinities with their own attributes. As you know from your readings, there was the Anito, or the god of the fences, of the forest, of fertility, and all of these things. Very similar to the saints. We also know that the saints have patrons for impossible cases, patrons for lost things, patrons for study, and the like. So what is the result when these two systems meet? If you look at this equation I made, the local polytheistic religions with belief in a supreme being, that's the Philippine side, would be equal to the monotheistic religion with lively cults and minor deities presented by the Spaniards. So because of this, I argue that it was not a stretch for the early Filipinos to see their own religion in the religion presented by the Spaniards. In short, they would see similarities. I am sure they also saw differences. And knowing how locals According to Charles MacDonald, what happened was a form of transformative continuity, which he defines as using the same belief structure within a new framework. So how was this operationalized in the Philippines? So essentially, it became a transposition of the polytheistic belief system into the polytheistic structure of folk Christianity. Aside from that, pre-Christian or pre-colonial elements which were similar in structure to the new religion became the basis for the Philippinization of Catholicism. The customs of the Hispanic Catholicism, like saints, funerary rituals, could prosper because they were very similar to those which were already existing in the Philippines, and thus they were acceptable to priests. And my suspicion is that the Filipinos presented these to the priest in the guise of Catholicism rather than in the guise of their own indigenous beliefs. It retained polytheistic structure but also fulfilled pre-Christian religious needs such as prosperity and health. And that is probably why a lot of people say Philippine Catholicism is very transactional. And this harks back to the pre-colonial religious belief system. So the result of this is that Catholicism is Philippinized and localized. And I think the very obvious examples of this would be the many feasts and fiestas which are celebrated in the Philippines. So if you look at these photos, these are the well-known scenes from the Feast of the Nazarene in Quiapo, Manila. And people all over the world have wondered at, the size of the crowds, the devotion, the passion of these devotees, that they would line up for hours, that they would walk in their bare feet on concrete just to be part of the Nazarene. And if you look closely, much of the time, priests would tell the people, do not do this, it is not necessary, that is not taught by Catholicism. But it persists, and it has persisted for centuries. Other examples of the feasts would be the fluvial processions, which are river-borne processions, and they can be found in any place in the Philippines with a river. They are usually dedicated to the patron saint or patron saints of the towns which are on the river. And in particular, the photograph on the right shows the fluvial procession for the Feast of the Lady of Peña Francia, held every September in Naga. And as you can see, there are so many participants, it is definitely a very big deal. In contrast to the very solemn fluvial procession, we have the riotous regatta, which is seen in the bottom photograph. A regatta is a boat race, and I think it is reminiscent of the early boat races held by Filipinos in their caracoas. Of course, this would not be acceptable to the Spanish priests. So what I think is that the Filipinos packaged these regattas, these boat races, as part of a feast or in honor of a patron saint or the Virgin Mary or Christ. And because of this, they became acceptable to the Spanish priests. The photograph on top, of course, I'm sure you recognize as the actual crucifixions, which are done during Holy Week, Good Friday. And as you know, these are spectacles so many people watch, and usually the proponents of these, the people who have themselves crucified, do so in fulfillment of an oath or a promise, usually in exchange for a favor granted by God, something that is very large, such as cure from illness or something like that. And every single priest will say that is not necessary. Christ does not want you to crucify yourself. But it persists and continues to persist. The Doctrina Christiana, pictured here, is the earliest book published in the Philippines in 1593, and it was a tool for catechism, for preaching, for spreading the word of Christianity. So how did the early Spanish priests do this? And also, how did the early Filipino catechists do this? Because I do believe that it was also because of them that this idea, this particular kind of Filipino Catholicism spread. Let us look inside. The contents of the Doctrina are written in 3 languages. In Baybayin, which is one of the Philippine scripts pictured here on the left, in Romanized Tagalog, pictured on the right, and also in Spanish. So it was written apparently for someone who could read Baybayin. And I think this is evidence that the Filipino catechists used it quite a lot. If you look at the way that the lessons are taught or the structure of the catechism, these are classic catechetical forms such as question and answer. So for example, if you read through the right side of the visual, there are questions and answers such as, alin kaya ang tanda ng Kristiyano? What is the sign of a Christian? The answer is, ang Santa Cruz, the Holy Cross. Question, sino kaya ang sinasamba ng mga Kristiyano? Answer, ang ating Panginoong Diyos. And so on down the line. So Catholicism in the Philippines is not a simple conversion from one religion to another, as you have seen. Filipinos actively co-opted certain elements, rejected others, combined religious practices and beliefs from both into a syncretic religion that we can call Filipino Catholicism. So it was a two-way street. It's not only Filipinos who were Catholicized or converted, but it's also Catholicism itself and the Spanish priests who were Filipinized.